Hello everyone, and welcome to my Young and the Restless official 24 channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. The words hung in the air like a dagger, slicing through the fragile quiet that had barely been holding Kyle together. And though the living room had been filled with tension for days, it was Claire's young son's voice that shattered every ounce of strength Kyle thought he had left. Let's break up with my mom. So simple, so raw, so brutally innocent. And yet it carried the weight of 1,000 accusations, as if this child who barely understood the full complexity of adult relationships had somehow absorbed the echoes of whispered arguments, slammed doors, and the heavy silences that had marked Kyle and Claire's journey. And in that moment Kyle felt his entire world collapse around him, his chest tightening as though every breath was suddenly a punishment, his eyes stinging with a pain he could not disguise. Because hearing those words from the child who had once accepted him with a hesitant but hopeful smile, who had once tugged on his hand to show him drawings, who had once sat in his lap as though Kyle's presence was enough to make him feel safe, now rejecting him in the most heartbreaking way, was like being exiled from the very family he had tried so desperately to build. And he remembered how it had started, how he and Claire had fought so hard to prove that love could conquer secrets, betrayals, and the shadow of her past with Victor's manipulation and her own mistakes. But children are the truest mirrors, aren't they? Reflecting back the pain and confusion of the adults around them. And Claire's son had clearly been watching, listening, feeling the storm even when they thought they had hidden it. And now he had given voice to the fear that Kyle had been too terrified to admit. That perhaps their love was not enough. That perhaps every sacrifice he had made, every bridge he had burned, every apology he had whispered into the dark, might not matter if the child at the center of it all did not believe in him anymore. And so Kyle cried, not the quiet, dignified tears of a man holding on to control, but the gut-wrenching sobs of someone who realized he was losing not only the woman he loved but also the child who had become a part of his heart, his family, his future. And he tried to speak, to say something that could undo the damage, but every word felt hollow because how could he explain adult failings to a child who only wanted peace, stability, love? Who only wanted to stop feeling the tension that filled their home. And Claire, standing just a few feet away, felt the room tilt as guilt consumed her, because though she had fought to believe in Kyle, fought to trust in him despite the secrets with Victor and the broken promises, she could see now how much the turmoil had affected her son, how the boy had internalized the chaos. And though she wanted to pull him close and tell him that families don't break up this way, that Kyle wasn't the enemy, that love was still possible, she also knew that children's words have a way of forcing adults to face the truth they don't want to see. And as Kyle's tears fell freely, he looked at Claire with an ache that begged for reassurance, begged for her to say something, anything, to show that her son's words didn't mean the end. But Claire herself was trembling, caught between the man she loved and the child she had vowed to protect. And in that moment she could not form an answer, because maybe, just maybe, her son was right. Maybe breaking up was the only way to give him the peace he craved. And so the silence between them grew heavier than any argument they had ever had, pressing down until Kyle's sobs echoed like confessions in a cathedral, raw and unfiltered, and the memories of every promise he had made replayed in his mind. The nights he told Claire he would stand by her, the days he told her son he would never leave, the hope he had painted for all of them. And yet here they were, crumbling beneath the weight of a child's plea, and he wondered if love was ever truly enough when innocence was broken and trust was gone. And though Claire finally moved, stepping closer to her son and gathering him into her arms, whispering words of comfort that Kyle could not hear, the image was enough to drive the knife deeper, because Kyle realized then that no matter what he felt, no matter how much he wanted to fight, the decision might already have been made, not by him, not even by Claire, but by the small voice of truth that had spoken louder than all their denials. And so he wept, his heart splintering, because let's break up with my mom was not just a child's frustrated cry, it was the beginning of the end. Kyle sat frozen in that moment, his tears refusing to stop, his breath catching like every sob was tearing pieces of his soul away, because he couldn't comprehend how everything had unraveled so quickly, how love that had once felt indestructible now hung by the fragile thread of a child's plea. And the worst part was knowing that Claire's son hadn't spoken from malice but from a raw, unfiltered place of truth. And Kyle's heart broke all over again because he could remember so vividly the day he first met the boy, the nervous smile Claire had given him, the guarded way the child had studied him, as if trying to decide whether Kyle would be another fleeting figure in a life already scarred by instability, and Kyle had promised himself that he would never, ever let the boy feel abandoned again. But now here they were, with that same boy begging to end it all, and Kyle wondered if he had failed so completely that even his best intentions had been seen as lies, because children, no matter how young, have an instinct for authenticity, and perhaps Kyle's turmoil over his own family legacy, the baggage of being a Newman by marriage and an Abbott by blood, the endless pressure from Victor, the constant scrutiny from Jack, had seeped through in ways he hadn't realized, poisoning what should have been a safe and steady foundation, and Claire stood there clutching her son like he was her anchor, and though Kyle wanted to move closer, to explain, to beg, he couldn't bring himself to interrupt that moment. Because it wasn't his place anymore, not when the child's words had drawn such a sharp line, and so he stayed still, trembling, his tears wetting his hands as he covered his face, and his mind raced with flashes of all the times he had tried to be present, taking the boy to the park, teaching him to kick a soccer ball, reading him bedtime stories when Claire was exhausted, only to realize that perhaps love alone could not erase the shadows of doubt. Perhaps love could not drown out the sound of arguments muffled behind closed doors. And as Claire whispered softly to her son, Kyle could hear faint fragments, promises of safety, reminders of love, and though none of them were directed at him, they cut just as deep, because for the first time he realized that maybe Claire's loyalty, the very thing he had fought to earn, was divided beyond repair, torn between the man she loved and the child she was bound to protect. And what kind of mother wouldn't choose her son? What kind of mother wouldn't listen when her child cried out for relief? And so Kyle began to accept, with a growing ache, that this wasn't about him winning Claire's heart anymore. This wasn't about proving himself against Victor or against Jack. This was about a little boy whose voice had become the deciding factor in their love story. And the more he thought about it, the more he felt the crushing inevitability that no matter what Claire truly wanted, she could never look her son in the eye and ignore his pain. She could never tell him that his feelings didn't matter, because Claire knew better than anyone what it was like to grow up unheard, dismissed, treated like a pawn in someone else's game. And so Kyle's tears were joined by a cold, suffocating realization that this might be the end, not because they had stopped loving each other, but because loving each other wasn't enough to protect the innocence of a child caught in the middle. And Claire, torn apart by her own guilt, finally looked up at him, her eyes glassy, her lips trembling, and though she didn't speak, the silence between them was louder than any words could have been, because Kyle understood. She was already letting go, she was already making the choice he had feared, and though he wanted to scream, to beg, to argue that families fight, families heal, families don't just shatter because of one plea, he couldn't ignore the truth that her son had spoken what they had both been too afraid to admit. Maybe the relationship had already broken, maybe the cracks were too deep. And so Kyle's body shook as he sobbed harder, his tears staining the floor, and somewhere deep inside he knew that this moment would haunt him forever, because nothing could compare to the devastation of being rejected by a child you had grown to love as your own. Nothing could compare to the heartbreak of realizing that even though you had poured your soul into creating a family, sometimes love simply wasn't enough. And as the room grew heavier, as the silence turned unbearable, Kyle felt like he was drowning in the echoes of that one sentence, "Let's break up with my mom," and he wondered how he would ever breathe again without feeling its sting. Kyle's mind became a storm of memories and regrets, a relentless tide that refused to stop crashing against him as he stood frozen in the echo of those 6 devastating words. And though he tried to swallow them down, to find some strength within himself, he could not escape the truth that Claire's son had spoken aloud, because the boy's voice carried not only his own pain but the unspoken weight of everything Kyle and Claire had failed to shield him from. Every whispered argument behind closed doors that had carried through the thin walls, every slammed door that had rattled the picture frames, every prolonged silence at the dinner table when words had been swallowed instead of spoken. And in that raw honesty Kyle heard the verdict he had feared most. He was not enough, his love was not enough, their family was not enough. And so his tears fell harder, each one burning like a scar across his face, because what could he possibly say to a child who wanted nothing more than peace, who had already endured too much turmoil, who had carried burdens that no child should have to carry. And though Kyle wanted to drop to his knees and plead with the boy, to promise him that he would do better, that he would protect him, that he would love him as fiercely as he loved Claire, he knew deep down that promises might sound like lies to ears that had grown tired of hearing them. And his heart splintered further because he realized he had underestimated the way children absorb the truth. Without explanation, the way they can see through facades adults construct. And he wondered if perhaps the boy had sensed Kyle's fear of becoming like his own father, of failing as Jack had failed so many times, of losing everything the way Kyle had lost Summer, of repeating the same painful cycles, and maybe that fear had shown through in the cracks of his smiles, in the hesitation of his reassurances. And so when Claire's son said, "Let's break up with my mom," he wasn't just voicing a desire for quiet but perhaps also rejecting the instability he felt simmering beneath the surface. And Kyle could not deny it, could not fight it, because deep inside he feared the boy was right, that maybe love had already frayed too much to be mended. And Claire's eyes, full of tears and guilt, only confirmed the ache because though she wanted to deny it, to tell her son that families don't end like this, she knew better than anyone that they sometimes do. She had lived it in her own childhood, had been a pawn in Victor's manipulations, had seen how love could be weaponized and broken, and she could not risk repeating that cycle with her child, not even for Kyle. And though Kyle silently begged her with his eyes, though his sobs pleaded louder than any words could, Claire stayed rooted, her arms wrapped protectively around her son, her lips pressed to his hair, and in that simple gesture Kyle saw his answer. Her son would always come first, as he should. And Kyle was left standing outside of the circle they formed, left watching love slip away from him in slow motion. And his mind spun back to all the moments he had believed would secure them as a family, the nights of laughter when they had cooked dinner together and spilled sauce on the floor, the afternoons of painting messy pictures at the kitchen table, the quiet mornings when Claire's son had crawled into bed between them and Kyle had thought to himself, "This is it, this is home." And yet even those bright memories now felt fragile, overshadowed by the storms that had come after, the mistrust, the secrets, the manipulations of Victor that had pitted them against one another. And though Kyle had fought so hard to prove his loyalty, he had not realized how deeply the collateral damage had seeped into the boy's heart, how much he had witnessed and internalized. And Kyle wept harder because he had failed not only himself and Claire but the child he had sworn never to let down, the child whose trust he had promised to earn. And now that trust had been withdrawn in the most cutting way, with a single sentence that carried more power than any adult ultimatum could. And Kyle felt himself unraveling, his body shaking, his soul aching, because he didn't know how to move forward from here, didn't know how to fight when the battle was already lost. And as Claire finally looked up, her expression a storm of love, sorrow, and resignation, Kyle understood that she would not, could not, undo what her son had said. And though she hadn't spoken the words aloud, her silence was agreement, her silence was acceptance, and Kyle collapsed inward, his heart shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces, because in that moment he knew that no matter how much he loved them both, no matter how much he wanted to hold on to the dream of their family, this was the beginning of the end, and there was nothing he could do but weep and carry the unbearable truth that sometimes love is not enough. Sometimes even the deepest devotion cannot silence the voice of a child crying out for peace. And as the night closed in around them, heavy and suffocating, Kyle realized that this heartbreak would haunt him forever, the words echoing in his chest long after the tears dried. "Let's break up with my mom." Kyle didn't even know how long he sat there in that suffocating silence, his sobs eventually tapering into shallow, uneven breaths, his eyes swollen and raw from crying. And yet the ache inside his chest only grew heavier, a gnawing emptiness that made every second feel like an eternity. Because when a child looks at you and essentially tells you that your place in their world is unwelcome, it cuts deeper than any betrayal from an adult ever could. And though Kyle wanted to cling to denial, to tell himself that Claire's son was just overwhelmed or repeating words he didn't fully understand, the truth was far crueler. Children speak from their hearts, and that honesty, however painful, cannot be ignored. So as Claire held her son tightly, whispering words that Kyle could not hear, Kyle was left on the outside of that embrace, aching for a place within it, longing to be part of the security they shared, and yet recognizing that in this moment he was a stranger, a disruption, the very storm the boy wanted to escape. And the weight of that realization pressed down until Kyle felt like he might collapse under it, his knees weak, his body trembling. And he thought back to all the sacrifices he had made to prove himself worthy of Claire and her child, how he had distanced himself from his family at times, how he had fought with Jack, clashed with Victor, endured the whispers of judgment from those who doubted the relationship, and he remembered the nights he lay awake, wondering if he was strong enough to give Claire the stability she deserved, if he was good enough to be a stepfather. And now, with just one sentence, all those sacrifices seemed meaningless, stripped away by a child's plea for peace. And though Claire's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she finally turned toward him, Kyle knew before she even opened her mouth that the conversation he feared most was coming, the one where love would be weighed against responsibility, where her loyalty to her son would eclipse her love for him. Because as much as Claire loved Kyle, she had vowed long ago never to let her child suffer the way she had as a pawn in her own fractured family. And so Kyle braced himself, his heart racing, his stomach churning, because he already knew the outcome even before the words left her trembling lips. And when she finally whispered, "Kyle, he's just a child, but I have to listen to him," the last remnants of hope inside him cracked wide open, because in those words was the confirmation that she would choose her son, as she should. And yet the knowledge didn't make it hurt any less. It didn't stop the crushing weight of loss from consuming him, and he shook his head violently, choking on his sobs as he tried to protest, tried to insist that love could survive this, that they could find a way to reassure the boy, to rebuild. But Claire only tightened her hold on her son, her own tears spilling now as she whispered, "I can't let him feel trapped. I can't ignore what he's feeling, Kyle, not after everything I went through growing up." And those words gutted him because he understood. He truly did. He knew the wounds Victor had carved into her childhood, knew the trauma of being unheard, manipulated, silenced, and yet he couldn't stop the agony of realizing that he was now on the other side of her vow, that in her desperate attempt to protect her child she was willing to let Kyle go, willing to sacrifice their love, and his mind screamed with the injustice of it, because hadn't he proven himself, hadn't he fought hard enough, hadn't he shown again and again that he was committed, that he wanted to be there for both of them? And yet none of that mattered now because a child's voice had shifted the scales, and Claire, bound by maternal instinct and haunted memories, could not ignore it, and so Kyle staggered backward, his body shaking as though the air itself had turned hostile. His eyes locked on Claire and her son wrapped together in an unbreakable cocoon of love, and he realized that no matter how much he begged or cried, he would always be the outsider now, and the sobs tore through him again, guttural and raw, because he wasn't just losing Claire, he was losing the family he had dreamed of, the boy he had come to see as his own, the future he had built in his heart, and he didn't know how to live with that loss, how to breathe without it crushing him. And in the shadows of his despair another thought began to creep in, dark and insidious, the thought of Victor, always lurking, always watching, waiting for the perfect moment to exploit weakness. And Kyle knew in his bones that Victor would use this fracture to his advantage, would twist the situation to pry Claire further from him, to remind her that Kyle could never provide the stability she and her son deserved, to paint Kyle as the selfish man who had put his own needs above the peace of a child. And the very idea made Kyle's stomach twist with dread, because if Victor got his claws into Claire again, if he whispered in her ear at her most vulnerable moment, Kyle might not just lose her. He might watch her be swallowed whole by the very darkness she had worked so hard to escape. And the thought terrified him. But as he stood there trembling, his face wet with tears, his voice broken from sobbing, he didn't know how to stop it, didn't know how to fight when the woman he loved was already drifting away, when her son's words had already become the undeniable truth between them, and so Kyle broke all over again, collapsing into the weight of it, sobbing until his body shook violently, until his chest ached with the force of it, because the words still echoed endlessly in his mind. "Let's break up with my mom, let's break up with my mom." And no matter how many times he tried to silence them, they rang louder than his own heartbeat, a haunting refrain that promised to follow him for the rest of his life.